All right. Welcome to Middle School Sunday School. Still virtual for now. I know some of you are going in person, but we still have this virtual option. So last week, we talked about David and Saul. And let me see if I can lower the camera a little bit. Oh, that's. Let's see if that looks okay. Yeah, so we talked about David and Saul, and they were how they were at war with each other, and how Saul is basically willing to destroy some of the people in Israel to get to David, which is not really something you want in a king, you know. So today we're still talking about this ongoing battle, but we're going to change our focus. Instead of focusing on the men, we're going to look at two incredibly brave women who were caught in the crossfire of this war and still did what they thought was best. We've talked about before about how being a woman in the ancient world was not an easy thing. If anything, a woman's position was precarious and completely dependent upon the men in her life. If they disappeared, if they died or ran away or whatever, she would be destitute, not even allowed to earn a living or survive without them. Women needed men to survive in ancient societies, in most of them, and men did not always treat them kindly. If a woman defied the men in her life, whether that's a husband or a father or sometimes even a brother, she could risk horrible things happening to her. From being beaten to being disowned and cast out to any number of repercussions. So for a woman to ever stand up to a father or a husband was a braver act than many of us can imagine. It's kind of like, taking a boss and a father figure and wrapping them together and being like, but if they fire me, I have no means of getting another job and I will be poor and have to beg, and that's all I can do. So I want you to keep that in mind when we discuss these two women, Michal and Abigail. You might be like, oh, Michael is a boy's name. Think technically the biblical Michael should be, pronounced more like Israel. So you can hear that Israel, so it'd be Michael or Michael. But this is just Michael. There's no EL. The EL is, an ending in a lot of biblical names because that means like of God. So that's how you get Israel. Michael, there's Gabriel. Yeah, we as English, we blur the A and the E together for Michael, but that's really not the original intent. But here we have a girl named Michael with only an A, no EL. So, first we'll talk about Michael. And to do that, we kind of need to back up a little bit to before this whole war between David and Saul even started. So this story takes place during the time period where David still lived in the court and was greatly esteemed by all. Except Saul was beginning to grow jealous of David and was passively trying to plan David's death. So instead of like actively trying to kill him, he's just like, let's get rid of him. Sorry, I'm fixing my shoes. All right, so we're going to start with 1 Samuel 18:17 through 19. 1 Samuel 18:17 through 19. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines deal with him." David said to Saul, "Who am I and who are my kinsfolks, my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But the time when Saul's daughter Merab should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Mahalathite, as a wife. Because of David's many victories, Saul basically promised David his eldest daughter in marriage. But Saul was also like trying to get David killed in battle with the Philistines at this point. So he didn't really think David would actually live to marry Merab. So in the meantime, Saul married Merab off to some other man. David, for his part, well, it's not like he's actually in love with Merab or anything like that. Love wasn't often a factor in ancient religions. What he cared about religions, in ancient marriages. What David cared about was the great honor of becoming son-in-law of the king, basically becoming related to the king. And in regards to that honor, he was humble and all like, who am I to deserve this? This is kind of weird to us modern people because we'd think David would care about the girl more than about the position the marriage conferred to him. But that's not the case. Marriage back then was really not about love. And for a king, marriage was almost always about alliances and politics. All right, so keeping on. 1 Samuel 18, 20 through 23. 1 Samuel 18, 20 through 23. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Saul was told, and that pleased him, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, see, the king is delighted with you, and all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants reported these words to David in private. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and of no repute? So Saul had promised Merab, but then he married Merab off, right? So if he wanted to make this work, he still needed to give David one of his daughters. Turns out his other daughter, Michal, was actually, in love with David. Whether she was in love with him, whether she was infatuated with him, we don't really know. We don't know how much she actually interacted with David. And Saul was like, great, she likes David. I'll give her to David. And if David survives my evil scheme, which he won't, then he'll be my son-in-law and he'll be bound to my family. So Saul tells David that he'll be a son-in-law again. And then he also instructs the servant to tell him in private and be like, see, the king loves you. You don't have anything to worry about. Saul's totally got your back. He wants you to be part of his family. But David is still humble and is like, what did I do to deserve this? I'm just like a random guy. All I did was kill Goliath. I don't know if I deserve to be like related to the king. 1 Samuel 18, 24 through 29. The servants of Saul told him, this is what David said. Then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servant told David these words, David was well pleased to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David rose and went, along with the men, and killed 100 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a wife. But when Saul realized the Lord was with David, and that Saul's daughter Michal loved him, Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy from that time forward. So the servants report back to Saul David's humbleness, and Saul's like, I can use this. He doesn't think he deserves it. Well, I'll give him a Herculean task, right? Where he can earn the honor, but it will be an impossible task, and he'll never succeed, and he'll die. And then I never have to worry about stupid David ever again. Yay, Saul. So Saul tells David he has to kill 100 Philistines and bring back proof that he killed them to earn Michal's hand in marriage. He's like, there's no way David will survive this. He's just gonna die, right? Like, this is gonna be the end of David, and I'll never have to worry about him again. But then, surprise, David does it and lives through it. So Saul really has no choice but to go through with his promise and let him marry Michal. This just makes Saul hate David even more. Because Saul realizes God is with David. That's what makes David a threat. Not that he's just like a great, warrior or anything like that, but that God has got his back against Saul. So Saul can see the writing on the wall, to paraphrase another biblical story, or to reference one, that God has chosen David. Fast forward a bit, David is still at court, and everyone is realizing that Saul wants to kill David. Another successful battle against the Philistines happened, where David comes back victorious, and Saul is so mad. He wants to kill David. So, 1 Samuel 19, 11 through 17. Saul sent messengers to David's house to keep watch over him, planning to kill him in the morning. David's wife Michal told him, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through the window. He fled away and escaped. Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed. She put a net of goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothes. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, "He is sick." Then Saul sent the messengers to see David for themselves. He said, "Bring him up to me in bed, that I may kill him." When the messengers came in, the idol was in the bed with the covering of goat's hair on its head. Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped?" Michal answered Saul, "He said to me, 'Let me go. Why should I kill you?'" Saul sends messengers to basically stake out David's house, right? So that in the morning, Saul can kill David. But once again, everyone in Saul's court pretty much knows at this point that Saul wants to kill David. And Michal can see it as well. She basically tells David that he's going to get killed in the morning if they don't do something that night. So she helps him escape through the window. Remember, Michal is David's wife, but she's also Saul's daughter. Without David there to protect her, she falls back into her father's family. She could easily fall under her father's wrath. And we're already seeing that Saul's a little unstable, right? There's no reason to trust he wouldn't turn that wrath on her. But she still hatches this plan to help her husband escape. And then she covers for him as long as she can. She basically pulls a complete Ferris Bueller, right? And makes it look like there's somebody sleeping in the bed. And, when the messengers come, she's just like, "He's sick." It's ridiculous. This is like the oldest trick in the book, literally. They have been doing this, fake the pillows under the bed thing with some fake mop for hair since like 1000 BC. So nothing's new under the sun. So when Saul hears this, he demands proof. And so they go there looking for tea. Oh, sorry. Oh, this is not tea. This is just water. He demands proof. So they go to the bed, pull back the sheets. Boom. They've been tricked. It's obvious. Saul goes to his daughter first and demands to know why she would side with David against him. Once again, Michal is in a very precarious position right here. Her father has decided her husband is an enemy. Her father is the king of Israel. If she says the wrong thing, it could mean her own death. So she lies and basically says David threatened her life. Michal saved David's life here, even though by doing so, she essentially betrayed her father. These were her choices. Betray her father, betray her husband, be in a no-win situation, right? And if she had gone with David, right, you're like, well, why didn't she just run away with him? Someone had to be there to put up the front that David was sick. Otherwise, they would have just been like, pull back the covers and been like, oh, this is clearly not him, right? She had to run interference so David had time to get away. Otherwise, they would have gotten him almost instantly. So Michal's role was critical in saving David's life, even though it meant standing up to her own father. And basically, no longer being David's wife, with David being gone, makes her a child again under her father's house. So she's now back under the authority of her unstable father. This is a very questionable situation for her own well-being, right? All right, but now we're going to fast forward and talk about another woman who also defied the man in her life. This story takes place while David is in the wilderness, hiding out from Saul. So 1 Samuel 25, 2-4. There was a man in Maon whose property was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was clever and beautiful, and the man was surly and mean, and he was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So the setup here is we have this man named Nabal, and he's married to a woman named Abigail. Nabal is described as surly and mean and wealthy, while Abigail is described as clever and beautiful. Nabal is described as a Calebite, which just means he's a descendant of Caleb. He's still an Israelite. Caleb was one of the guys back in Moses' time. David is basically hanging out in the wilderness near here, and he hears that Nabal is out in his field shearing his sheep. That brings us to the next section. 1 Samuel 25, 5-8. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Thus you shall salute him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm. They missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your sight, for we have come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." David sends some of his troops, his men, down to Nabal, and he tells them exactly what to say to Nabal. They are to greet him very respectfully. David then implies that his army has been protecting Nabal and his property, and that Nabal should be both aware of this and who David is. And then, because it's a feast day, Nabal should therefore be feeling generous. David basically asks a favor of food and supplies for his army. Let's see how Nabal responds, this mean, surly, wealthy man. 1 Samuel 25, 9 through 13. 1 Samuel 25, 9 through 13. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David. And then they waited. But Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have butchered for my shearers and give it to the men who come from whom I do not know where?" So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. David said to the men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every one of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So, the young men approached Nabal, and he basically feigns ignorance. He's like, "David? I don't know any David. I just see some random strangers who are trying to get a handout. No, thank you. You guys go away." Not very generous. When the men report this back to David, he is furious, like ridiculously angry to the point where he lets his anger get away with him. Because David knows Nabal should know him. They've been doing this service of protecting Nabal's land. And now he basically wants to kill Nabal. So he orders his troops to suit up and readies 400 men to go down and basically destroy Nabal and like all of his stuff. This is not actually a good response to this. David is letting his temper like way get away from him. You know, is Nabal being surly and mean and ungenerous? Yes. And David's like, "I'm going to murder you for it." Dude, we all just need to calm down. Deep breaths. 1 Samuel 25, 14 through 20. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he shouted insults at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we never missed anything when we were in the fields, as long as we were with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, and all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do, for evil has been decided against our master and against all of his house. He is so ill-natured that no one can speak to him." Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep ready for dressed, 5 measures of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. She loaded them on donkeys and said to her young men, "Go on ahead of me, I am coming after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. So, someone tells Abigail what's happening, that David came and sent men to Nabal, and Nabal basically insulted him. The man reminds Abigail that it's David's men who's been protecting them and has never harmed them, but also that Nabal is super ill-natured and that they're afraid David will do something rash and bring badness upon their house. While Nabal might deserve it, the rest of them don't. And I still don't think, being killed is an appropriate response to basically being a surly old man. So Abigail then does what seems reasonable. She wants to placate David and his men. So she packs up food and drinks and animals and loads it up on some carts for her men to take to David. But she also goes with them. The Bible then points out she did not tell her husband. She is acting in complete defiance of her husband's wishes. Sure, Nabal didn't directly tell her to not do anything, but she knows what Nabal said to David's men. She knows Nabal doesn't want to give David or his men anything. She knows her husband. She knows he's a surly, ungenerous, mean old man. I don't know if he's old. I'm just, She also knows that this is a stupid decision. That puts them all in danger from this army that's basically sitting on their doorstep. By defying her husband, she might save her people, but possibly at the cost of herself. Because when she comes back, Nabal might punish her. She knows this, but she does it anyway, because her people's lives mean more to her. But going before David is also dangerous, because David may not listen to her, and a lesser man might kill her to exact his vengeance against Nabal, or kidnap her, or do worse things to her. We don't know if Abigail's ever met David before. We don't know if she knows what kind of man he is, so she may have no idea what sort of reception she may receive. 1 Samuel 25:21 through 22. Now David had said, "Surely it was in vain that I protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. But he has returned me evil for good. God do so to David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." Meanwhile, David is being all super extra and angsty, right? Basically despairing that he ever protected these ungrateful people. He's a little hangry, right? But because David is a man of action, his angst isn't just words. He's planning on basically going down to Nabal's town and killing all the men, which isn't a very nice thing. Sure, Nabal isn't paying David his due, but killing everyone is a bit of an overreaction. Once again, David's letting his anger get the better of him. Both David and Nabal are acting like children. Nabal's like, "I don't want to share." And David's like, "Well, then I'm going to beat you up." These are grown men. All right, 1 Samuel 25:23 through 31. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and alighted from the donkey and fell before David on her face, bowing to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Upon me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the word of your servant. My lord, do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of the Lord whom you sent. Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, since the Lord has restrained you from the blood guilt, and from taking vengeance with your own hand, now let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be like Nabal. And now let us present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If anyone should rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living under the care of the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from a hollow sling. When the Lord has done to my lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause or having saved himself. But when the Lord has dealt well with my lord, then remember your servant." That was a lot. That was a mouthful. All right. 1 minute. Sorry. So Abigail reaches David and basically she begs. She bows to the ground and pleads with him. She admits her husband is stupid and that she didn't see the men when they were originally sent. She now hums to beg for her people. She begs for him to forgive Nabal because she brings everything David has asked for and more. She also then affirms that she knows he should be king and that she believes God will make him king. And that when that happens, he will not want to look back on this and feel bad or guilty. She begs for the life of every person she is responsible for because David is so mad that he's actually planning to go on a murderous rampage through her property and kill all of her people. So she's like overly apologetic, right? Because this is the only power she has, is to go before him and apologize, even though she did nothing wrong. And here she is with all of these things, right? This is the only power she has. It's not even a power. So let's see how David reacts. 1 Samuel 25:32 through 35. David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to meet me today. Blessed be your good sense, and blessed be you, who have kept me today from the blood guilt and from avenging myself by my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there would have been none left to Nabal so much as one male." Then David received from her hand that she had brought him, and he said to her, "Go up to your house in peace. See, I have heeded your voice and granted your petition." Her words make David realize what he was about to do was more than a little crazy. And he thanks God for sending her to have him stop him from killing anybody. And he thanks God for her good sense to defy her husband and come after him. Because if she hadn't come after him and begged him, his anger would have gotten the better of him and he would have killed all those people. This is actually something of a character flaw in David. And we're going to see this over and over. When he thinks he's been wronged or when he thinks something is his, he's not afraid to take it by force. He doesn't do this most of the time. But here and in a later story, we'll see it. He gets so wrapped up in what he thinks is rightfully his and his rage that he can't see the truth right in front of him about what he's doing and that it's wrong until someone points it out to him. In this case, that someone is Abigail. So David tells her to go home in peace and that he will not harm her or any member of her house, even her no good husband. 1 Samuel 25:36 through 38. Abigail came to Nabal, and he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him. He became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Abigail comes home, and Nabal is holding a huge feast, feasting on all the food he wouldn't give David and his men. When Abigail gets there, she says that he's drunk, so she doesn't tell him what she did. Possibly because in a drunken state, he won't remember when she tells him, but also possibly because in a drunken state, he might overreact to her words. Drunk people tend to not behave properly, and a common problem in drunk men can be that they get angry and beat people. So if she had told him then and risked his ire, he might have beaten her to death. So in the morning she tells him, and he goes like completely catatonic. Possibly Nabal's just an old man, and with the news he has some sort of stroke. We don't know. We just know that 10 days later for 10 days he basically doesn't move or do anything, and then he dies. Now Abigail is left without a husband. We have no idea at this point if she has a son or anything. Nabal was very rich, but his estate won't go to Abigail unless she has a son. Otherwise, it'll go to a male relative. So what happens to Abigail? 1 Samuel 25:39 through 44. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has judged the case of Nabal's insult to me, and has kept back his servant from evil. The Lord has returned the evil doing of Nabal upon his own head." Then David sent and wooed Abigail to make her his wife. When David's servants came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to take you to him as his wife." She rose and bowed down with her face to the ground and said, Your servant is a slave to watch the feet of the servants of my lord." Abigail got up hurriedly and rode away on a donkey. Her 5 maids attended her, and she went after the messengers of David and became his wife. David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, both of whom became his wives. Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Patli, son of Laish, who was from Galium. David hears Nabal is dead and is basically like, "Ha! I get it, God. I shouldn't take vengeance with my own hands because you are more capable of doing that than me." But then David is like, "Hey, that Abigail was pretty awesome. We should probably take care of her. Who knows what's happening now that Nabal's dead and she risked everything for me. So I think I'll marry her." So Abigail becomes one of David's wives. Which, remember, if she wouldn't have been able to inherit Nabal's estates, especially if she didn't have a son, which we presume she doesn't, so she's not able to inherit, this is really the best situation from her. Plus, her old husband was pretty lame, and David's pretty cool, all things considered. The only downsides are David is still being hunted down, and she's just one of David's wives. At this point, David has 3, and that number is just going to increase. This whole saga of David versus Saul can seem like just a bunch of dudes doing things. But both of these stories that we talked about today illustrate that women are always around and they're always affecting the outcomes, even if we don't talk about them, even when the Bible doesn't highlight them. In this case, the Bible gives us insight into these 2 women and how they change things. Michal saved David. Abigail saved every man on her property. Both women's actions put them in danger from the men in their lives. Saul could have seen through Michal's deception and had killed her for betraying him. David could have killed Abigail rather than listen to her. Nabal could have reacted in violence to her defiance of him, but they still acted because women, even though the men viewed them as property, they were still people with agency. They were still people made in God's image. They were still people trying to do what was best by God. They knew what they had to do. They knew what they had to do to protect the people they loved, to protect the people they had duty to, and they knew what they had to do, what was right in God's eyes. And being considered a man's property was not an excuse to not do what God wanted them to do. But these women doing this was probably the most dangerous thing they could ever possibly do, and far braver than what a lot of the men in the Old Testament do. So that is today's Bible story. Yay. And next week we will continue our story of battles of David versus Saul. So, prayer requests. Let me stop the recording.